It was a bright, breezy morning in the small town of Oak Ridge, a quaint dot on the map known mostly for its picturesque views and quiet highways. The morning seemed uneventful as Jim and his daughter Mia pulled into a rest stop halfway through their long drive. Jim, a retired Marine with a no-nonsense demeanor, had decided to take a road trip with Mia to visit his aging parents on the other side of the country. For Jim, the trip was not only a chance to reconnect with his family but also an opportunity to spend quality time with Mia, who had grown quieter since her mother passed away the year before. The rest stop was like any other, an unassuming oasis of vending machines, picnic tables, and a small restroom building surrounded by towering trees. Birds chirped overhead, and the air was fresh with the scent of pine and damp earth. A few other cars were parked nearby, their occupants stretching their legs or grabbing a quick snack. Everything seemed ordinary. Perhaps too ordinary. Jim parked the car near the shaded area by the picnic tables and glanced over at Mia, who had been unusually quiet during the drive. "We're stopping for a bit. Need anything, kiddo?" he asked, his gruff voice softened by the affection he held for his only child. Mia shook her head but didn't meet his eyes. She stared out the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Jim chalked up her mood to boredom. After all, long road trips weren't exactly thrilling for a 12-year-old. He grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler in the back seat and stepped out, stretching his legs as he surveyed the area. He noted a couple of families, a young man sitting alone with a laptop, and an older woman walking her dog. Nothing seemed out of place, except for one man. The man was tall and wiry, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and a hoodie despite the warm weather. He lingered near the vending machines, glancing around with what Jim's instincts told him was too much interest in his surroundings. Years of Marine training had taught Jim to trust his gut, and something about this man didn't sit right. Jim didn't want to alarm Mia, so he didn't mention it. Instead, he walked over to the picnic table and sat down, sipping his water and keeping an eye on the man. The stranger eventually moved closer to the parking area, his steps casual but purposeful. He passed near their car, and Jim's senses heightened as he noticed Mia stiffen in her seat. It was a small thing, but Jim didn't miss it. Mia's fingers moved subtly, almost instinctively, forming what looked like a deliberate gesture, thumb tucked into her palm, fingers closed over it. Jim's heart skipped a beat. It was a symbol he hadn't seen since his training days, an internationally recognized distress signal. He blinked, unsure if he'd imagined it. Could Mia, his quiet and withdrawn daughter, really be signaling for help? Jim stood, pretending to stretch, and approached the car. "Hey, Mia," he said casually, opening the door. "Why don't you come out and stretch your legs?" Mia hesitated for a moment before unbuckling her seatbelt and stepping out. Her face was pale, and she avoided eye contact. "I'm fine, Dad," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough for Jim to notice. He crouched down to her level, his voice low and steady. "Mia, is something wrong? You can tell me." Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she glanced over Jim's shoulder. He followed her gaze and saw the man from earlier standing near the restroom building, watching them. Jim's stomach churned. "Stay close to me," he said firmly, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. He guided her toward the picnic area, his mind racing. If Mia had signaled for help, it wasn't by accident. Something was wrong, and it involved the man who was now hovering at a distance. Jim's eyes scanned the area, assessing their options. The rest stop wasn't heavily populated, and there were enough blind spots where someone could easily disappear, or worse. His hand instinctively brushed against his pocket, where his phone rested. He didn't want to spook the man by making an obvious call, so he decided to keep things low-key for the moment. "Sit here," he told Mia, motioning for her to take a seat at the picnic table. "I'll be right back." Mia grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly firm. "Don't go," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Jim crouched again, his tone reassuring. I'm not going far. I just need to check something. Trust me, okay? Reluctantly, Mia let go, and Jim made his way toward the vending machines, keeping the man in his peripheral vision. As he approached, the man turned and walked toward the restroom, his movements quick and deliberate. Jim debated whether to follow but decided against it. He didn't want to leave Mia alone. Instead, Jim returned to the car and retrieved his phone. He pretended to scroll through it while covertly dialing 911. Keeping his voice low, he described the situation to the dispatcher, providing details about the man and his suspicious behavior. As he spoke, he noticed something chilling. A second person, a woman, had joined the man near the restrooms. She looked equally out of place, her demeanor too tense for someone stopping to rest. Jim's heart raced as he realized this might be more than a random encounter. He ended the call and returned to Mia, his mind working overtime. We're leaving, he said firmly, helping her into the car. But what about them? Mia asked, her voice trembling. Jim's jaw tightened. Don't worry about them. Just stay in the car. Before he could start the engine, the man and woman began walking toward their vehicle. Jim's pulse quickened. He stepped out of the car, his marine instincts fully activated. Can I help you? He called out, his voice calm but commanding. The man stopped, his expression hardening. No, just heading to the vending machines, he said, his tone casual but forced. Jim didn't buy it. He positioned himself between the strangers and his car, his stance wide and unyielding. You're too close to my vehicle, he said evenly. Move along. The man hesitated, and for a moment, it seemed like he might argue. But then the woman tugged at his arm, muttering something under her breath. They turned and walked away, disappearing around the side of the restroom building. Jim wasted no time. He started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror for any sign of the strangers. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he tried to process what had just happened. Mia's voice broke the silence. Dad, I saw them talking to a girl in another car before you came back. She looked scared. Jim's chest tightened. He glanced at Mia, his heart aching at the fear in her eyes. You did the right thing, signaling me, he said. I'm proud of you. As they drove away, sirens blared in the distance. Jim knew the police would handle the situation, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they had narrowly escaped something far worse. Jim's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, the car speeding down the quiet highway. The sun was now high in the sky, but its warmth did little to melt the chill that had settled in his chest. He glanced at Mia through the rearview mirror. She sat curled in her seat, her face turned toward the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her small frame seemed even smaller, as though she were trying to disappear into the fabric of the seat. Mia, Jim began, his voice softer now, attempting to mask the storm of worry brewing inside him. I need you to tell me everything. What happened back there? For a moment, Mia didn't respond. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, and her eyes were unfocused, as though she were watching a memory unfold before her. Finally, she let out a shaky breath. It was that man, she said quietly. He came over to the car when you went to the vending machines. He said he needed directions and started asking me weird questions. Jim's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his instincts flaring again. What kind of questions? Mia hesitated, her fingers tracing patterns on the window. He asked if I was traveling with anyone. If I liked long road trips. Stuff like that. Her voice trembled, and Jim's heart sank. Then he just stood there, staring at me. I didn't know what to do. So. I remembered that signal you taught me. The SOS one. Jim's throat tightened as he recalled the day he had taught Mia the signal, almost as a joke. They had been watching a survival show together, and he'd turned it into a mini lesson, explaining the importance of nonverbal communication in emergencies. At the time, he hadn't thought she'd ever need to use it. Now, the realization that her quick thinking had likely saved her life was both terrifying and reassuring. "You did everything right," he said firmly, meeting her eyes through the mirror. "I'm proud of you, Mia. You're braver than most grown adults I know." Mia's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Jim knew she was shaken, and he felt a deep pang of guilt for not noticing the danger sooner. He had let his guard down, and it had almost cost him everything. As they drove, Jim replayed the events in his mind, dissecting every detail. The man's too casual demeanor, the way he lingered near the vending machines, the sudden appearance of the woman. It all added up to something far more sinister than a chance encounter. His military training screamed at him that this wasn't random, it was planned. And if Mia's observation about another scared girl in a different car was true, then there was a bigger problem at play. He reached for his phone, careful to keep one hand on the wheel. Dialing the local police station directly, he gave them an update on what Mia had told him. The dispatcher, a woman with a calm but urgent tone, assured him that officers were already on the scene and investigating. She asked if he and Mia could stop by the nearest station to give a full statement. Jim agreed, knowing it was the right thing to do, but the thought of delaying their journey made his stomach churn. He just wanted to get Mia as far away from that rest stop as possible. "Dad?" Mia's voice was small, pulling him from his thoughts. "Do you think they're bad people?" Jim's jaw tightened. How do you explain the concept of evil to a child who's just had a brush with it? He took a deep breath, steadying his voice. "I think there are people in this world who make bad choices, Mia. Choices that hurt others. But there are also people who fight back, who make the right choices, even when it's hard. You're one of those people." Mia nodded slowly, but the haunted look in her eyes didn't fade. Jim felt a surge of anger toward the man and woman at the rest stop. If they were part of something larger, human trafficking, as his gut told him, then they weren't just bad people. They were predators. And they had targeted his daughter. As the miles ticked by, Jim became hyper-aware of every car that passed them on the highway. He scanned the mirrors constantly, his military training fully activated. If the man and woman had been working with others, it was possible they weren't out of danger yet. The thought sent a fresh wave of adrenaline coursing through his veins. After about 30 minutes, Jim spotted a sign for a small police station just off the highway. He pulled into the parking lot, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. The station was modest, with a handful of patrol cars parked out front and an American flag fluttering in the breeze. It was a stark contrast to the chaos Jim felt simmering beneath the surface. Inside, they were greeted by a young officer who led them to a quiet room where they could give their statements. Mia clung to Jim's side, her small hand gripping his tightly. Jim could feel her trembling, and he squeezed her hand reassuringly. As Jim recounted the events in meticulous detail, the officer took notes, nodding occasionally. When it was Mia's turn to speak, Jim was struck by her composure. Though her voice wavered at times, she described the man's questions and behavior with clarity, her brown eyes fixed on the officer as she spoke. Jim couldn't have been prouder of her bravery. When they finished, the officer leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "We've been seeing an uptick in incidents like this along this stretch of highway," he admitted. "Rest stops are prime locations for traffickers to scout potential victims. Your quick thinking might have saved not just Mia, but others as well." The words hit Jim like a ton of bricks. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was sobering. The officer went on to explain that the descriptions of the man and woman matched those of suspects linked to a larger trafficking ring operating across several states. Jim's blood ran cold. What happens now? Jim asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "We're working with state and federal agencies to investigate," the officer said. "Your report is crucial. If we can tie these individuals to other incidents, we might be able to shut down their operation." Jim nodded, but the words offered little comfort. The thought of other children, other families, being targeted by predators like these was almost too much to bear. As they left the station, Jim noticed a shift in Mia. She held her head a little higher, her steps a little firmer. He realized that, in her own way, she had found strength in the ordeal. She had faced fear head-on and come out the other side. Jim felt a swell of pride and relief, but also a lingering sense of responsibility. They got back into the car, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. As they pulled onto the highway, Jim glanced at Mia, who was staring out the window again. "You okay?" he asked. Mia nodded. "I think so," she said softly. After a pause, she added, "Do you think they'll catch them?" Jim's gaze hardened. "I don't just think so. I know so. And people like us, people who do the right thing, we're going to make sure of it." Mia didn't reply, but the corner of her mouth lifted in a faint smile. For the first time that day, Jim felt a glimmer of hope. They still had a long journey ahead, but he knew they would face whatever came next together. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink as Jim and Mia continued their journey down the highway. The tension in the car was palpable, even though neither of them spoke for a while. Jim's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, trying to make sense of the day's events while keeping one eye on the rearview mirror and another on Mia, who sat quietly in the passenger seat. Her usually curious demeanor was replaced with a withdrawn silence, and it worried him. Jim glanced at the speedometer and eased his foot off the gas. They'd been driving for nearly an hour since leaving the police station, and his instincts told him it was time to regroup. Spotting a diner up ahead, its neon sign flickering in the fading light, Jim made the decision to stop. They needed a break, some food, and a moment to process everything. The parking lot was half empty, with a few trucks and cars scattered around. Jim pulled into a spot near the entrance and turned off the engine. "Let's grab something to eat," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Mia looked up at him, her big brown eyes still carrying the weight of the day's ordeal. She hesitated but nodded. Jim took her hand as they walked into the diner, the smell of greasy burgers and fresh coffee greeting them. The place had a nostalgic charm, with checkered floors, vinyl booths, and a jukebox in the corner softly playing an old country tune. They chose a booth near the window, and Jim positioned himself so he could see the entrance. His Marine training was in overdrive, scanning the room for any sign of trouble. A friendly waitress appeared with a pad and pen, her bright smile a welcome contrast to the heaviness Jim felt. After taking their orders, a cheeseburger for Jim and chicken tenders for Mia, she disappeared, leaving them alone again. "Dad?" Mia finally broke the silence, her voice hesitant. "Do you think they were following us?" Jim leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "I don't know, sweetheart. But I do know that we're going to stay vigilant. I promise you, nothing's going to happen to you while I'm here." Mia nodded, but Jim could tell she was far from reassured. He wasn't sure if his words were for her or himself at this point. The waitress returned with their food, setting the plates down with a cheerful, "Enjoy," before bustling off to another table. Jim noticed Mia picking at her food more than eating it, and he decided to shift the conversation. "Remember that time we tried to make pancakes, and the batter ended up all over the kitchen?" he asked, a small smile tugging at his lips. Mia blinked, caught off guard by the change in topic, but then a faint smile appeared. "You said it was going to be Marine-approved pancakes, but we had to eat cereal instead." Jim chuckled, grateful for the moment of levity. "Hey, we all have our strengths. Mine just don't include pancakes." For a brief moment, the tension eased, and Mia even managed a small laugh. But the respite was short-lived. As Jim sipped his coffee, his eyes flicked to the parking lot, where a car he didn't recognize pulled in. His body tensed as he watched two figures step out, a man and a woman. It was them. Jim's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the man and woman from the rest stop casually stroll toward the diner. They hadn't noticed him or Mia yet, but their presence was enough to set every alarm in Jim's head blaring. He quickly shifted his focus to Mia, whose back was to the door. She was still obliviously poking at her chicken tenders. "Sweetheart," he said quietly, leaning across the table. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Don't turn around. Just stay calm." Mia froze, her eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong?" "They're here," Jim whispered, his voice steady but urgent. "The people from the rest stop. I don't think they've seen us yet, but we need to leave. Now." Mia's hands trembled as she set down her fork. Jim reached out and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "It's going to be okay," he said. "Follow my lead." Jim slid out of the booth, keeping his movements casual. He threw a couple of bills on the table to cover the meal and motioned for Mia to follow. They walked toward the exit, Jim's hand protectively on Mia's shoulder. His eyes darted between the two strangers and the door, calculating every step. As they passed the counter, the man turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the diner. Jim's heart stopped as the man's eyes landed on him, then on Mia. Recognition flickered across his face. "Go," Jim said firmly, pushing Mia toward the door. They burst out into the parking lot, the cool evening air hitting them like a slap. Jim scanned the lot for their car, his mind racing. Behind them, the diner door swung open, and he heard the man's voice calling out. "Hey! Wait a minute." Jim didn't wait. He yanked the car door open and practically lifted Mia into the passenger seat before slamming the door shut. Rushing to the driver's side, he jumped in and started the engine. The man and woman were now running toward them, their movements frantic. As Jim threw the car into reverse, the woman shouted, "Stop. We just want to talk." "Yeah, I bet you do," Jim muttered under his breath, flooring the gas pedal. The car shot backward before he shifted into drive, speeding out of the parking lot and back onto the highway. Mia was shaking, her hands gripping the seatbelt. "Dad, what do they want?" Jim's jaw clenched. "Nothing good, that's for sure." He checked the rearview mirror, his stomach sinking when he saw their car pulling out of the parking lot, headlights blazing. "They're following us," he said, his voice grim. Mia's breathing quickened, and Jim reached over, squeezing her hand. "It's going to be okay," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure how. His mind raced through his options. They couldn't go back to the police station without leading these people straight there, and losing them on a mostly empty highway would be a challenge. As the other car gained on them, Jim's military instincts kicked in. He spotted an upcoming exit and made a sudden turn, the tires screeching as the car veered onto a narrow country road. The other car followed, its headlights growing brighter in the mirror. Jim's pulse pounded in his ears as he navigated the dark, winding road. His hands were steady on the wheel, every nerve in his body on high alert. "Hold on, Mia," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos. The chase continued for what felt like an eternity, the other car relentlessly closing the gap. But then, up ahead, Jim spotted something, a narrow bridge spanning a creek. He remembered passing it earlier in the day and noting the sharp curve on the other side. An idea formed in his mind, risky but their best shot. "Mia, I need you to trust me," he said. "No matter what happens, stay in your seat and don't move." Mia nodded, her eyes wide with fear but filled with trust. Jim accelerated toward the bridge, waiting until the last possible moment before slamming on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop just before the bridge, and Jim threw it into reverse, turning sharply to block the road. The pursuing car, caught off guard, swerved to avoid a collision. It careened off the road and into the ditch, its headlights slicing through the darkness as it came to a halt. Jim didn't wait to see what happened next. He gunned the engine and sped away, his heart pounding as he put as much distance as possible between them and the incapacitated car. Only when they were miles down the road did he finally allow himself to breathe. Mia looked over at him, her voice trembling. "Are we safe now?" Jim nodded, though his eyes remained on the road. "For now," he said. "But we're not taking any chances." The night had grown darker as Jim navigated the winding country roads, his mind racing as fast as the car speeding through the quiet terrain. The adrenaline from the chase still coursed through his veins, and though the threat seemed momentarily behind them, he knew better than to let his guard down. Every shadow in the trees, every distant pair of headlights seemed to pulse with danger. He glanced over at Mia, who sat silent and pale, her small hands clinging tightly to the edge of her seat. He needed to keep her safe, and he needed a plan. The car's headlights illuminated a sign for a nearby town. It was small, likely no more than a cluster of houses and a single main street. Jim decided it was their best option for finding a safe place to regroup. He took a sharp turn off the rural road, the tires crunching on gravel as they entered the sleepy little town. The streets were deserted, save for a few dim porch lights and a dog trotting across the road. The eerie calm was a stark contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. Jim spotted a gas station at the far end of the main street, its fluorescent lights humming softly in the night. He pulled in, parking the car near the pumps but leaving the engine running. His eyes scanned the area, his body tense and ready to react at the slightest hint of danger. Satisfied that the coast was clear for the moment, he turned to Mia. "I need you to stay in the car," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "Lock the doors and don't open them for anyone but me. Understand?" Mia nodded, her eyes wide and filled with trust. "Be careful, Dad." Jim gave her a reassuring nod before stepping out of the car, his senses on high alert. The gas station was small, with a single attendant behind the counter, a young man who looked barely out of high school. Jim entered the store, the bell above the door jingling as he stepped inside. The attendant glanced up from his phone, his face a mix of curiosity and mild annoyance at the interruption. "Need gas?" the young man asked, his tone disinterested. "Not yet," Jim replied, his voice low but commanding. "I need information. Have you seen a black sedan come through here in the last 20 minutes? The attendant frowned, his brows knitting together as he considered the question. "Nah, haven't seen anything like that. It's been pretty dead tonight." Jim nodded, though his unease didn't dissipate. He scanned the store, noting the security cameras in the corners and the emergency exit at the back. He grabbed a bottle of water and a pack of snacks for Mia, not wanting to draw unnecessary attention to himself. As he paid, he leaned in slightly closer to the counter. "If you see anything unusual, a black sedan, two people acting suspicious, call the police immediately. Got it?" The attendant's eyes widened slightly, clearly unsettled by Jim's intensity. "Yeah, sure. I'll keep an eye out." Jim gave a curt nod and returned to the car, where Mia sat patiently, her hands now folded in her lap. She looked up as he opened the door, relief washing over her face when she saw him. He handed her the snacks and the water, then climbed into the driver's seat. "We're going to find a place to stay for the night," he said, starting the car. "I need to make sure we're off the road and somewhere safe." Mia nodded, her trust in her father unshaken. As they pulled out of the gas station, Jim's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, scanning for any sign of the black sedan. The road behind them remained empty, but he couldn't shake the feeling that their pursuers weren't far away. A few miles down the road, Jim spotted a small motel, its flickering neon sign advertising vacancy. It wasn't much, but it would do. He pulled into the parking lot and quickly surveyed the area before stepping out of the car. The motel was old, with peeling paint and dim exterior lights, but it was quiet. Jim checked them in under a fake name, paying in cash to avoid leaving a trail. Once inside the room, Jim immediately locked the door and secured the windows, pulling the curtains tightly shut. The room was sparse, a single bed, a small TV, and a rickety table, but it was a sanctuary compared to the chaos they had left behind. He turned to Mia, who sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. "You need to rest," Jim said, crouching down to her level. "I'll keep watch. Nothing's going to happen to you. I promise." Mia hesitated but eventually nodded. She crawled under the thin blanket, her eyes fluttering closed almost immediately. Jim sat at the table, his back to the wall and his eyes fixed on the door. He didn't allow himself to relax, his mind replaying the events of the day and analyzing every detail. As the hours passed, the weight of the day began to settle on him. He thought about the man and woman from the rest stop, their cold, calculating eyes, and the way they had pursued them with such determination. Jim knew they weren't just random criminals, they were part of something bigger, something organized. And he had no doubt they would stop at nothing to achieve their goals. Just as Jim began to feel the first stirrings of fatigue, a sound outside the window snapped him to attention. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing as he listened. It was faint, but distinct, the crunch of gravel underfoot. Someone was out there. Jim moved silently to the window, peeking through a small gap in the curtains. His heart sank as he saw a figure moving in the shadows, their form partially obscured by the dim light. He couldn't make out their face, but the shape of their body and the way they moved told him all he needed to know. It was the man from the rest stop. Jim's mind raced. They had found them. He turned to Mia, who was still asleep, her breathing slow and steady. He couldn't let her wake up to this nightmare. He grabbed his phone and dialed the police, keeping his voice low as he explained the situation and their location. The dispatcher assured him that officers were on their way, but Jim knew they might not get there in time. He moved back to the window, his eyes scanning the parking lot. The man was joined by the woman, her silhouette unmistakable. They were moving toward the room, their intentions clear. Jim's grip tightened on his phone as he considered his options. He wasn't armed, but his training had prepared him for situations like this. He just needed to buy time until help arrived. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and then there was a knock at the door. It was light, almost polite, but Jim knew better. He stepped away from the window and positioned himself near the door, his body ready to react. "Who is it?" he called out, keeping his voice steady. There was a pause, and then the woman's voice came through, sweet and deceptively calm. "We just want to talk. Open the door, and we'll explain everything." Jim's jaw tightened. "If you don't leave, the police will explain everything to you." There was a moment of silence, and then the doorknob jiggled. Jim's heart pounded as he braced himself, his mind calculating every possible move. Just as the tension reached its peak, the distant wail of sirens filled the air. The man and woman froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. Jim watched through the peephole as they exchanged a glance before retreating into the shadows. The sirens grew louder, and moments later, the flashing lights of police cars filled the parking lot. Jim exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding as officers swarmed the area. He opened the door cautiously, his hands raised in a gesture of compliance. The officers quickly secured the scene, and Jim explained everything to the lead detective. As the night wore on and the suspects were apprehended, Jim finally allowed himself to relax. He turned to Mia, who had woken up amidst the commotion but remained calm. He pulled her into a tight hug, his voice thick with emotion. "It's over," he said. "You're safe now." Mia looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "You kept your promise," she said softly. Jim smiled, holding her close. No matter what came next, he knew they had faced the worst together, and won. The aftermath of the night's events settled heavily on Jim as he stood outside the small-town police station, the early morning light casting long shadows across the parking lot. Mia sat beside him on a bench, her head resting on his shoulder, still groggy but calm. The world seemed eerily still now, as though holding its breath after the chaos of the previous hours. The sirens were gone, the flashing lights no longer painted across the walls, but the weight of what had transpired lingered in the air. Inside, the two suspects, Roy and his accomplice, Karen, as the officers had identified them, were in custody, their faces a mixture of anger and defiance. Jim had watched as the police led them away in handcuffs, their plan unraveled by a single moment of vigilance and a young girl's courage. It was satisfying to know they were off the streets, but Jim couldn't shake the nagging thought of how close it had been. Too close. The door to the station opened, and a detective stepped out. He was an older man, with a graying mustache and the weary expression of someone who had seen too much of the world's darkness. He carried a thick folder under one arm, his other hand resting on his hip as he approached Jim and Mia. "Mr. Callahan," the detective said, his voice rough but kind. "We've got them booked and are starting the interrogation process. Thanks to your quick actions, we might have just cracked open a major trafficking ring." Jim straightened, his marine instincts still keeping him alert. "What do you know so far?" The detective sighed, glancing down at his folder. "Roy and Karen have been on our radar for a while, but they've always managed to stay one step ahead of us. They're part of a larger operation that targets vulnerable people, especially kids. They use rest stops, small towns, and other inconspicuous places to scope out their targets. Your daughter wasn't the first they've approached, but thanks to her quick thinking, she might just be the last." Jim felt a surge of both pride and anger at the detective's words. Pride in Mia for her bravery, but anger at the thought of how many others hadn't been as lucky. He glanced down at her, her small frame still pressed against his side. She was listening, though her face betrayed no emotion. Jim knew she was processing everything, just as he was. "Do you think they'll talk?" Jim asked, his voice steady. "We're hopeful," the detective replied. "The fact that they were caught in the act gives us leverage. And based on what we've found so far, they were connected to at least 3 other incidents in this area alone. With any luck, we'll be able to piece together enough evidence to take down the entire operation." Jim nodded, his jaw tightening. It was a small victory, but the battle was far from over. He knew that for every Roy and Karen caught, there were others still out there, preying on the vulnerable. The thought made his stomach churn. The detective crouched down, his gaze softening as he addressed Mia directly. "You did something very brave last night, young lady. That signal you used, it saved your life and possibly the lives of others. You should be proud of yourself." Mia lifted her head, her eyes meeting the detective's. I didn't know what else to do," she said quietly. "I was scared." "That's what makes it even more impressive," the detective said with a small smile. "Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing even when you are. And you did the right thing." Mia's lips curved into a faint smile, and she leaned back against Jim, who wrapped an arm around her shoulders. The detective straightened, handing Jim a card. "If you think of anything else or need to talk, call me. And if you're heading out of town, let us know where you'll be. Just as a precaution." Jim took the card, slipping it into his pocket. "We will. Thanks for everything." The detective gave a nod before heading back inside, leaving Jim and Mia alone again. The morning sun was climbing higher now, bathing the town in a golden light. It felt almost surreal, as though the terror of the night before had been nothing more than a bad dream. But Jim knew better. The bruises on his soul, and the lingering tension in his muscles, told him otherwise. "Dad," Mia said softly, breaking the silence. Do you think they'll stop now? The bad people? Jim sighed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I think we stopped these bad people. But there are always others. That's why it's so important to stay alert, to look out for each other. And what you did, Mia. You looked out for yourself and for others. That's more than most adults would have done. Mia was quiet for a moment, then said, I don't want anyone else to go through what we did. Jim's chest tightened at her words. He could see the resolve in her eyes, the determination to make a difference, even as young as she was. It was a reminder of how resilient she could be, and how much potential she had to grow into someone truly remarkable. As they got back into the car, Jim started the engine and pulled onto the highway, the road stretching out before them. They were headed for his parents' house, where he hoped the familiarity and comfort of family would help Mia heal from the ordeal. But as they drove, Jim couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The town they left behind would feel the ripple effects of the arrests. Parents would talk to their kids about safety, local law enforcement would heighten their patrols, and the story would spread, sparking conversations about vigilance and community. Jim hoped it would lead to real change, to a world where fewer people had to face what they had. For Mia, the experience had already begun to shape her in ways Jim couldn't fully understand yet. She was quieter, more introspective, but there was also a new strength in her, a steeliness born of having faced fear and come out the other side. Jim didn't know what the future held for her, but he knew one thing for certain, she would carry this experience with her, and it would make her stronger. As the miles passed and the sun climbed higher, Jim glanced over at Mia, who had finally dozed off in the passenger seat. He smiled softly, grateful that she could find some rest after everything they'd been through. He reached over and gently adjusted the blanket draped over her, his heart swelling with love and pride. The road ahead was long, but they would travel it together. And no matter what challenges lay in their path, Jim knew they would face them as a team, stronger, braver, and more connected than ever. The road stretched on as Jim and Mia made their way toward his parents' house, the rolling hills and thick forests of the countryside gradually giving way to open fields and scattered farmhouses. The tension of the past 2 days was beginning to lift, but its shadow still lingered, casting a quiet over the car that neither father nor daughter seemed eager to break. For Jim, the silence was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it gave him space to process what had happened, but on the other, it left him alone with the nagging guilt and anger he felt for not realizing the danger sooner. He glanced over at Mia, who was staring out the window, her thoughts seemingly miles away. They passed a sign welcoming them to the small town of Bridgewater, where Jim's parents lived. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, where people knew their neighbors, and the biggest excitement was the annual county fair. It was the perfect place to regroup, to find some sense of normalcy again. But even as the familiar landmarks came into view, Jim couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same, not for him, and certainly not for Mia. As they pulled into the gravel driveway of his parents' modest home, the sight of his mother, Ellen, waiting on the porch brought a wave of relief. She was a petite woman with silver hair and kind eyes that had always held a calming presence for Jim, even in the toughest times. Standing beside her was his father, Frank, a retired teacher whose quiet wisdom had guided Jim through many of life's challenges. Ellen's face lit up as the car came to a stop, and she hurried down the steps, her arms outstretched. "There you are. We've been worried sick." Jim barely had time to get out of the car before his mother enveloped him in a hug, her frail arms somehow conveying a strength that steadied him. "We're fine, Mom," he said, his voice steady but tired. "It's been a long couple of days." Ellen pulled back, her eyes scanning his face before moving to Mia, who was climbing out of the passenger seat. "And there's my sweet girl," Ellen said, her voice softening as she knelt down and pulled Mia into a gentle hug. "Are you okay, honey?" Mia nodded, but her expression remained distant. "I'm fine, Grandma," she said quietly. Jim watched as his father approached, his pace slower than it used to be but no less steady. Frank clasped Jim's shoulder with a firm grip, his sharp eyes studying him. "You've got that look again," Frank said, his voice low and knowing. "The one you used to have when you came back from a mission." Jim sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It feels like one," he admitted. They moved inside, where the warm, familiar smell of Ellen's cooking filled the air. The house was a time capsule of Jim's childhood, with shelves lined with books, family photos, and the same worn furniture that had been there for decades. It was comforting in a way that Jim hadn't realized he needed until now. As they sat down in the living room, Jim gave his parents a brief rundown of what had happened, keeping the details sparse for Mia's sake. He didn't want to revisit the darkest parts of the ordeal in front of her, but he also knew his parents deserved to know the truth. Ellen listened with wide eyes, her hand covering her mouth at times, while Frank's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as Jim spoke. When he finished, there was a heavy silence. Ellen was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "I can't believe something like that could happen, and to Mia, of all people." "Thank God you were there, Jim." Frank nodded, his gaze shifting to Mia, who sat quietly beside Jim on the couch. "And thank God you had the presence of mind to act, young lady," he said, his tone firm but filled with pride. "You're a brave girl, Mia. Braver than most people I've met." Mia looked up at her grandfather, her lips twitching into a small, shy smile. I didn't want anything bad to happen," she said softly. Ellen reached over and took Mia's hand, her touch gentle. "You're safe now, sweetheart. That's what matters." Over the next few days, life at the house began to settle into a routine. Jim and Mia spent their time helping Ellen in the garden, playing board games with Frank, and taking long walks through the quiet countryside. It was a welcome reprieve from the chaos, a chance to breathe and heal. But even as the days passed, Jim could see that Mia was still grappling with what had happened. She was quieter than usual, more introspective, and she often seemed lost in thought. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jim found Mia sitting on the porch swing, her legs tucked under her. He joined her, the swing creaking softly as he sat down. For a while, they just sat in silence, watching the fireflies dance in the fading light. "Dad," Mia said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think those people, the ones who took me, do you think they've done this to other kids?" Jim's chest tightened at the question, but he didn't want to lie to her. "I think they have," he said honestly. "But I also think that because of you, because of what you did, they won't be able to hurt anyone else." Mia nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I just keep thinking, what if I hadn't done the signal? What if you hadn't noticed? What if?" Jim reached over and placed a hand on hers, stopping her spiral of thoughts. "Mia, you did everything right. You were brave when it mattered most, and because of that, we're here, together. Don't let the what-ifs take that away from you." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I just don't want to feel scared all the time," she admitted. Jim's heart ached at her words, but he also felt a swell of pride for her honesty. "You're stronger than you think, Mia," he said. "And it's okay to feel scared. What matters is what you do with that fear. And you've already shown that you can face it head-on." Mia leaned into him, her small frame fitting perfectly against his side. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Jim felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in days. They had been through something unimaginable, something that would leave its mark on both of them forever. But they had also come out stronger, more connected, and more determined to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The events of the past week would ripple out in ways Jim couldn't yet predict. The arrests of Roy and Karen would lead to a larger investigation, uncovering a network of traffickers and bringing justice to those who had been hurt. The small town where it all began would implement new safety measures, and the story of Mia's courage would inspire others to stay vigilant and protect one another. But for Jim and Mia, the most profound impact was personal. They had faced fear, danger, and the unknown together, and in doing so, they had forged a bond that nothing could break. And as they sat on the porch swing, watching the stars and listening to the crickets sing, they both knew that they would carry this experience with them, not as a burden, but as a testament to their strength and resilience. "Dad," Mia said after a long silence, her voice thoughtful. "Do you think we'll ever forget what happened?" Jim looked down at her, his expression serious but gentle. "I don't think we'll ever forget," he said. "But I don't think we're meant to. What happened taught us something important. It taught us how strong we are, and how important it is to look out for each other." Mia nodded, her face thoughtful. "I think you're right." And in that moment, Jim realized that they weren't just survivors, they were a team, ready to face whatever came next, together.